Hello, welcome back to my channel. So today I want to do a video all about the ISTP personality type. I have a matrix that I want to go through in this video, this overused, underused, strength, weakness matrix, where we can talk about what is ISTP's overused strength, their underused weakness, really get into their cognitive functions and really get into the depth of what makes the ISTP tick. So if you don't know what a cognitive function is, it's going to be really important to this video. So Myers Briggs actually came after what Carl Jung coined in 1921, which are cognitive functions. So these are the 8 cognitive functions here. So this is by no means exhaustive or in depth, but if you want to pause it, it can be kind of a starting point to figure out, which function really calls out to you. Because a lot of times the online tests are very frequently unreliable. Sometimes they are correct, sometimes they're incorrect, so it's really hard to say. So I wouldn't put too much stock or get too attached to whatever result you got from an online test, but really just learn about the cognitive functions and type yourself in that way. So all of the 16 personalities use all 8 of these cognitive functions in a specific order, in a specific way, which gives them a specific flavor. So for the ISTP, this is the order in which they use these cognitive functions, and I have their abbreviations listed here. So loosely speaking, this is descending in order of importance. So to the ISTP, this is what they value in descending order of importance. And also loosely speaking, this is descending in chronological order, at which order these get developed and kind of become strengths within the personality type. So maybe, introverted thinking, that first function, that really has been with you your whole life. Then maybe teens, 20s, that second function starts being more prominent. Then your 30s, your third function, your 40s, your fourth function, and kind of so on down the line. So to add a little bit more nuance to this, your top 4 functions are conscious and valued, and your bottom 4 functions are not valued and not conscious. So a lot of times biases can show up in those bottom 4 functions. Those are functions that you don't tend to value. You don't tend to value those things in other people. But within your top 4 functions, maybe even 3 and 4 are not strengths within you, but you still value those. So maybe you pick a partner who has those traits, even if they're not strengths within you. So to add a little bit more nuance to this, the functions in green, 1, 2, 5, and 6 are potential strengths. It's kind of the default for a lot of people. And 3, 4, 7, and 8 coded in red are probable weaknesses. So this is kind of like the default state. It's not true 100% of the time. And especially the older and older you get, the more likely that some of these functions kind of flip and become strengths. The younger you are, the more likely that a lot of these are red zones before maturity has really happened. But there's every likelihood that this is kind of the default of how things are operating. So I want to make a caveat, just because 5 and 6 are green and their potential strengths, I wouldn't hop down and focus on those, because like I said before, this is still descending in order of importance. So I would still start with 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and work your way down chronologically. That overused, underused strengths weakness that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is where this really comes into play. So I'm going to just really zone in on those top 4 functions, because there's so much meat to unpack in the functions that are conscious and valued. So I'm going to go through this matrix. I'm going to go through each of those functions in depth for the ISTP and how these functions in these specific positions show up specifically for the ISTP. So here I have from a previous video that I did where I took quotes from Carl Jung, from John Beebe, from Myers and Briggs, and what they said about, what does the first function do? What does the second function do? And so I had to have a whole video where I really went into those, and I just put the bullet points here. So if you want to pause it and look into this, you can, but this is by no means in depth, and I'm not going to go into it here because of the previous video. Okay, so getting into your cognitive functions, this is your first function, introverted thinking, or abbreviated TI. So introvert means to turn inward. Intro means inward, vert means to turn. And Carl Jung actually coined the words introvert and extrovert, and he got those words from Benet's words introspection and externospection. So spect from introspection means to watch over. So to introvert in that moment means to turn inward and watch what's happening inwardly, to kind of be introspecting. And if you do that habitually, then you're considered an introvert. And when you turn inward and you're processing what happens inwardly, there's a lot of things you could be turning into. It could be feelings, it could be a lot of different things, but for the introverted thinker, it's turning into their own thoughts, their own principles, questioning things, to truth, to logic, inward. How do things make sense to the individual? So this is your first function. So since it's your first function, it is your overused strength. This is who you feel like you are. This is chronologically the function that's been with you your entire life. So as an ISTP, you should see evidence of yourself using this function as a young child. It's been with you throughout your whole life. It's the water you swim in. Carl Jung says that it basically never stagnates. Like you couldn't stop if you wanted to. You just feel compelled to do this thing all the time. So I just did a series where I went through Carl Jung's writing, Vanderhoop's writing, and Myers and Briggs' writing, and I looked at a lot of the key themes within these functions. So these bullet points here are quotes that I actually have Typically, they're from Carl Jung. I prioritize his quotes over other people. So they're typically quotes from him, and they've got an arrow for how this could show up maybe externally, or maybe like what my own thought about the function is. But the number one word that showed up for introverted thinking was principles, being very principled. They have strong principles. So that's kind of the number one word that I associate with introverted thinking. A truth is another word that shows up very commonly. So this is something where introverted thinkers, I think, earn a lot of respect, and they're worthy of a lot of respect because they become so principled and so truth-oriented in a very sound way. And because it's first, it's such a skill, just like a natural talent for this thing, and it's an introverted function, so you don't feel like it's pushed on you, like people are pushing values or their ideas onto you, but it's a principled nature. I think I'm going to say often seen as the strong silent type, but it's someone who earns a lot of respect, but they're not showy about it. And I think that this is a really respectable function. There are a lot of quotes about they have a lot of exactitude and scrupulousness. So that's a lot of, precision. This could be with their work. They're very, a lot of exactitude and fine details, got that image in the top that I think really shows about, some of this precision, this scrupulousness, a methodical pace. So this is a type that they really want to make sure that things are done correctly and that, kind of every step has, all fit into the logical puzzle here. So their communication style is also full of, this exactitude and this scrupulousness. So this can have technical communication in it. There's kind of a fine tune with definitions, even in everyday words. I find that they're very good at understanding the exact definition of what a word is, not the connotation, but the actual dictionary definition of a word. So a lot of technical skills. I'll notice a lot of saving clauses or it depends. So they're very unlikely to exaggerate in a story, especially if we're looking at this function here, but they're very likely to say, well, not all the times, but sometimes, and it depends, and there can be a tendency toward, but it will depend on X and Y and Z. And so their communication is very careful. Introverted thinking is described as reserved, quiet, and detached. And so I said this, but they're often seen as a strong silent type. And they can be incredibly quiet. And I'll get into, how the second and third function play into that, but they can be incredibly quiet. Introverted thinking is skeptical of validity of truth, the validity of others, the validity of themselves. They're very skeptical and questioning and critiquing, but they don't just, limit that to other people. Some types can be very critical externally. And this is not critical, I wouldn't say. It's a critiquing, but it goes both ways. They're doing it to themselves all the time. And there's nothing like malicious about it, but it's just wanting, everything within the process to have been clean so that the knowledge at the end is right. So they question themselves with integrity. Something that I really admire about introverted thinking when introverted thinking is done well is, readily admitting that they're wrong, because that skepticism gets applied to themselves as well. They're turning inward, they're introspecting. Does this make sense? Does this make sense to me? I don't know if this makes sense to me. And so there is a lot of exactitude and scrupulousness. So this function is your number one strength. This is who you feel like you are. So a lot of times if people are feeling down, it's because they haven't allowed this function space to thrive and to, get in relationships that value this function. So on the previous slide, if you saw some of those quotes from Carl Jung talks about the introversion gives you access to the self and to reflection. So it's not necessarily being alone. It's not necessarily, extroversion is not necessarily being with people. But it's turning inward and reflecting and having an access to yourself and a knowing of yourself, and in this case, the thoughts. So, it's easier to do that type of thing when you're alone, but you could still be in a group of people. You could be in a group of 40 people and you tune them out, and in that moment, you're processing your thoughts and introspecting. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with people or not, but it's externospection and introspection, turning inward and processing. So this gives you access to yourself and to reflection. But it's important to have both then. We don't just have access to ourselves and to reflection, but we also have access to the world and action taking, which is what extroversion gives you access to. So your second function is Extraverted Sensing, abbreviated SE. And this is your underused strength. This is something that you are maybe born with a talent in, but you haven't developed the skill in, perhaps. It's something that people can tend to water down. People can really tend to neglect this function because you're an introvert and this is an extroverted function. So there's a tendency to not get into this function. And especially if people have a misunderstanding of what extroversion is, they really are averse to getting into this function. But this function is not going to a bunch of dinner parties necessarily. This is just turning outward to action taking into the world. It's not necessarily turning outward to people, but to action taking in the world, and especially in a physical way. So Carl Jung talks about that the second second function adds complexity to the type. When you're just your first function, you're growing up, before the second function has really come on the scene, you're just in that first function and there's kind of a one-dimensionality. But then as you get into like teens, 20s, you really start getting into this second function. It starts adding complexity to the type. So by the time you're like 16 or so, all 8 of the functions are working kind of in their default way. But as you're getting into your 20s, the second function starts to become more of a strength. And a lot of times I see with ISTPs, teens, 20s, this SE really starts to be more at the forefront. Although there is always a tendency, no matter what stage of life you're in, there's always a tendency to neglect the second function. There are quotes about that. And that's just because you're an introvert and this is an extroverted function. But you're an ISTP. So to neglect this function is to neglect a huge part of you, which is a sensor. And a lot of times people can tend to restrict their second function to a small area of life. They say, okay, I'll use SE when I'm playing sports, but I don't use it in any other way. I don't use it to be present or to be adaptable or to react to things quickly or, to do things, I just use it to this one small area of my life where I sometimes play sports, but most of the time I'm just in my house, So it's important to really broaden the scope of the second function because it adds so much range and prospect. So the number one word used for the function extroverted sensing is sensation. So there are quotes about enhancing sensation, fresh sensations, intense sensations. And ISTPs might hear this and they're like, I don't know that I really do that. But this second function is incredibly watered down. It really has a tendency to be neglected. So just be mindful of that as I go through it. But the words that use for extroverted sensing are excitement, lively, vigorous, jolly. Something I notice with ISTPs could be like one-liners, like these wisecracks or pranks or something. At the bottom I've got like this, like a firecracker or maybe dynamite or something, or like eating spicy foods. These are like intense sensations. So the senses are at the forefront. So one thing that extroverted sensing is really good at is working with tools. And I don't necessarily mean that in the stereotypical way, like a hammer is a tool, although it could be, but it's all different types of tools. They can get really good at, this could be a musical instrument, getting very technically skilled at a musical instrument. So I'm using the word tool loosely, but it's, any sort of thing that you could work with. This could be a tennis racket could be a tool, a paintbrush could be a tool, a computer could be a tool, so they get really good at working with tools, especially that are in a sensory way. And so I think that this is the best way for ISTPs to spend time alongside friends. I hear a lot of ISTPs talking about how they feel like they're awkward or they're really quiet and they like want to have friends, but they're like, if I have friends, it will require me to talk. And your extroverted function, extroverted sensing, is not particularly communicative in a verbal sense. It's much more in the body. And so I feel like what would be best for, ISTPs if they feel like they want more friends or whatever to be around people is get people that you can do things alongside, like play tennis alongside them or play disc golf alongside them or play soccer. So you're still around people and you're still getting that extroversion, the access to action taking in the world, but it's not so people oriented. You know what I mean? So when I say get into extroversion, I really just mean for the ISTP, it's getting into your body. Extroverted sensing has quotes about being very good with reacting, seizing the moment, being very adaptable. So the extension of this is act quickly in all areas of life. So, a lot of times it's kind of hard to get ISTPs to get into sports, for example, say, hey, let's go play soccer. And then they're like, and they don't really want to. And then they get into it and then they're really enjoying it. It's who you feel like you are. And I feel like ISTPs know that when they get into SE, they just kind of come alive, but there's such this slow to get into it. So take that kind of sports environment that acts quickly and is in your body and apply that to all areas of life, to act quickly in all areas of life, to not procrastinate. One rule that I think SE users have really responded well to is if you think of something that needs to be done, like the trash needs to be taken out or something, and it would take less than 2 minutes, just do it now. And for some reason, SE users seem to, really have responded well to that. Extroverted sensing is the type best in realism. It's not overestimating or underestimating, but it's seeing things as they actually are. And extroverted sensing accepts things as they are, very matter-of-factly. And something that there's kind of a bravery with extroverted sensing. I think TI and SE, you combine these two and you get a very brave individual. You get into introverted intuition and there could be some issues. But these two functions, when they're really in tune and in touch with one another as a very brave individual. And extroverted sensing is just very present and engaged with life. Just in general, I think that's what extroverted sensing gives you, a presence and just engaging with life, the vibrance of life. And so I think a lot of times, I've got a lot of sports images here, but extroverted sensing is, because there are quotes that Carl Jung uses about sports, but it's a lot more than that. It's just being engaged with life. I've got some of the funny things like the whoopee cushion or the spicy pepper, but really the common theme, I just kind of picked how this could show up. It doesn't have to show up in these images, but just the underlying theme of this is things that make you present and engaged with life and in your body and action taking. So I recommend that everyone work on their second function for a long time, like 5 years. Myers and Briggs talk about if you want any hope of developing a function, you need to isolate it. You can't work on too many things at once because there's a lot of opposite polarities going on here. So to work on one thing would be the opposite of doing the other things. So really work on this function because, motivation kind of ebbs and flows. And so really get into it, get around SE DOMs, get in your body, get outside, really commit to doing this because Carl Jung talks about it lends so much range and prospect and maturity. This is the function that a lot of people talk about, that they feel like they're coming home to themselves because you're an ISTP. So to get rid of this S function is to get rid of a very significant part of who you are. So John Beebe calls this function the parent function. And when you think about what a good parent does, they set expectations for themselves. They set proper expectations for children, for others. And so it's kind of funny to talk about because this is it's almost like a childlike function in a very physical way, but it's your responsibility to do this very childlike thing. You're being the most responsible, most mature version of yourself who doesn't slack, who doesn't let yourself off the hook when you get into this function, when you get into your body. These two functions in combination, 1 and 2, are when you are in like your genius zone. So it is you're always going to be in that first function. It just does not stagnate. But your second function, you have a responsibility to get into that function. And this is the function where you can really mentor other people. A lot of times your first function, you're just such a natural at it that it's hard to really teach people that thing. But your second function is where you were born, like you've got this talent for it, but you had to earn it. You work on this function for 5 years. You've seen, the pitfalls. You've seen what's difficult about it, what's easy about it, what the value that it gives. And so then you can really teach people to get into extroverted sensing. You can teach people extroverted sensing things. So your third function is Introverted Intuition, or abbreviated NI. So everyone's third function is the direct opposite of their second function. So since your second function is extroverted, this one's introverted. Since your second one is sensing, this one is intuition. So introverted intuition is the direct opposite of extroverted sensing. Since extroverted sensing is your underused strength, this one is your overused weakness. This is the function that everyone tends to be a lot in their third function because you're an introvert and this is an introverted function. So there's a tendency to overindulge there in the self and the reflection space. But it becomes too much of the same thing and it becomes not enough action taking in the world and being in your body. So the thing about this function is that because it's the direct opposite of your second function, it's called a polarity. They're like the North and South poles, one thing that I've called it. You cannot be at the North Pole and the South Pole at the same time. They're direct opposites. Or you can think of them like a light switch. The light switch can either be flipped up to SE or it can be flipped down to NI, but you cannot be in both. You can rapidly switch, kind of like people can think they can multitask. You can rapidly switch from SE to NI and oscillate quickly, but they're opposites, so you can't do them both at the same moment. You can't be inwardly reflecting and also be outwardly acting at the same time. You can rapidly switch in minute seconds, but you can't do them both at the same time. So the thing about this opportunity cost is if you choose to be down in introverted intuition because you value that introversion, it's comfortable to be in that space of introversion, you're choosing to not be in extroverted sensing because you can't be in them both at the same time. So by choosing to be an introverted intuition, you're choosing not to be a sensor. You're choosing not to be an ISTP, which is who you are. You're choosing to get into that INTP space. So this is really, it's like a falsification of the personality. There are quotes about there's a lot of cowardice here. This function, John Beebe calls the child function. I think of this as like a bratty teenager, It's not all bad, like children are not all bad, but you don't want children to drive the car or to make decisions. A lot of times there's a lot of hubris in this function. So a lot of times people will get into this function when they're in an argument or if they're feeling defensive or insecure or, maybe if they're just feeling generally depressed. This function is something that people can really tend to dig into. And in the case of the ISTP, it lends a lot of just an overall feel of stagnation. So this function is introverted intuition. So introvert, once again, means to turn inward. But instead of turning inward to like the thoughts as in introverted thinking, this is turning inward to the intuitions. And intuitions are the opposite of sensing. So sensing is like what you are experiencing in the case of SE or have experienced. It's what exists. And introverted intuition is processing what doesn't exist. So this could be an idea, this could be the future. And the number one word used for introverted intuition is vision. So it's a lot of times it's turning inward and processing the vision of what does not exist. So there are quotes about how introverted intuition will rely exclusively on the vision. And the thing is that when you rely on the vision, you're not relying on the senses. When you rely on what does not exist, you're not relying on what does exist. And for the ISTP, they do incredibly well in this realistic world. This is how, not overestimate, not underestimate, but this is how things actually are. This is what's real. This could be, dreading activity. A lot of times in this third zone, you take the positive qualities of a function and you like twist it, or you take the negative qualities of a function. So in the case of this vision, I've noticed a lot of times it's a negative vision, like, dreading the activity. Oh, if I do this, I don't know if I'm gonna have enough energy. It's this lethargy. Sometimes I've heard a lot of ISTPs, this bad snowball effect, like if this happens, then this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. So our quotes, the introverted intuition sees things in a clear outline. But if this is like your number one strength, you would see it in an optimistic way and how things realistically are. But once you get down to this overused weakness zone, it just becomes really negative, and it can just play into a lot of fear. I've got this image in the bottom of this person kind of going into the unknown. So introverted intuition does a lot of processing meaning and purpose. And when you get it down to this third zone, that can be meditating on meaninglessness and purposelessness. So it's just like, everything's meaningless, everything's purposeless. I know a lot of ISPs, so they got NI third, who will read, philosophy books or even, existentialism, or get into that type of thing. And it's a lot of times oriented on this meaninglessness and purposelessness. There are quotes that introverted intuition is detached, cold, aloof. And, you take that with, if this gets looped in with introverted thinking, everyone tends to be too much in their first and third function combined. It's just incredibly detached and aloof. So this could be taciturn, procrastinating. It could be watching too much TV, too much solitude, too much space, too much silence, kind of like a hermit. So these are things how it could be. It's too much, turning inward to the self in just this stagnation, as opposed to, again, extroversion is access to the world and action taking. So, it's a lack of getting into action. There's a quote from Introverted Intuition that the bodily existence fades from view. And that is just so true for, I think, ISPs who have Introverted Intuition third. So that can be, shutting down, maybe in an argument, just kind of shutting down, feeling kind of mute. I've got this picture of this person being mute, procrastination, dissociating from the body, very lethargic, very stagnant. The bodily existent just majorly can fade from view. Introverted intuition has an inability to express what it means. And introverted thinking already also has issues kind of expressing, the complexity of its thoughts. So this can be incredibly nonverbal. Extroverted sensing gets you into your body and speaking, and this can be just incredibly nonverbal. There are quotes from Introverted Intuition about having a lot of self-will, obstinacy, stubborn, arrogant, resisting on principle. And the introverted judging functions, TI and FI, already have some of those issues as well. So you get kind of this double dose of kind of stubborn, obstinate, arrogant. TI and NI both have arrogance issues, so you're getting kind of a double dose of that. Now, luckily, it's an introverted function, so people aren't gonna, you won't be saying things probably that make you sound arrogant. I mean, maybe. But a lot of times there's just a general vibe of arrogance. It's things that's communicated through, like, the nonverbal communication. So I've got pictures here about this function leads to procrastination, being nonverbal, just sitting on your phone, being lethargic, kind of this, these swirly, it's kind of hypnotized eyes, like it could be on the phone or TV or whatever. The future seems scary. So this function just lends, just in general, the overall feel is just lethargic and stagnant. So one thing I've been saying in these videos is that I think a lot of times if people are involuntarily single, so they're single but they don't want to be, it comes down to this third function, because a lot of times you want to be a mature person and you want to find a mature person. And so this third function is kind of the immature function. It's the bratty teenager. This is the function that really I think is kind of hindering people's maturity. So you want to allow your second function, the parent function, to parent this function, which is the child. For SE to say, okay, introverted intuition, we're going to use you if you're going to give us an interest, you give us an interest in philosophy, you give us an interest in reading, maybe you give us an interest in podcast, and that's great. But we're not going to use you if you're going to make us procrastinate or fear or dread the future or be lethargic. So, this one has to come under subordination to extroverted sensing, which is the parent. And extroverted sensing needs to be the one calling the shots, not the bratty teenager. Yes, this is the overused weakness. This is a function that I see people use a lot. This is a lot of times people will mistype based on this third function. So I've encountered a lot of ISTPs who have told me that they used to think that they were INTJs because there's so much in this NI that they think that that's actually what they are. But when they finally learned, they're like, I realized that the way that I was using it was a lot in the negative way, that it probably wasn't my dominant function if the way I use it is constantly and consistently negative. So finally to your fourth function, and these images are kind of cheesy, I'll get to those in a second, but your fourth function is extraverted feeling. So everyone's fourth function is the direct opposite opposite of their first function. Since your first function is introverted, this one's extroverted. Since your first one is thinking, this one is feeling. So extroverted feeling is your fourth function. So once again, just like the second and third function, we have like a light switch, North Pole, South Pole polarity situation. So since your first function is your number one strength, it basically never stagnates. It's who you feel like you are. That light switch is almost always flipped up to TI, and it's almost never flipped down to FE, especially if you're younger than like in your 40s. Like once you get into your 40s, maybe this function starts coming on the scene. But for a lot of people under 40, this function is just completely absent. This is not a function that they thought about. And John Beebe calls this the inferiority complex. So a lot of times people feel like they're so bad at this function. And the reality is that you're probably not great at this function, especially if you're under 40, but you're not as bad as you think you are. It's an inferiority complex. So this is your underused weakness. Your third function is a weakness because you overuse it. People can tend to overuse it too much. This one's a weakness because it's not used enough. Because a lot of times we'll have the belief, my first function and my first function only will get me what my first function wants. But actually, instead of getting what your first function wants, it creates a prison of that first function. So this could be principles and principles only will make me the most principled person, or truth and truth only will make me the most truthful person. But a lot of times you need experiences to be the most principled. How can you be the most principled truth person who knows the truth the most if you've shut yourself off to experiences? And so a lot of times it's experiences with people. They're going to actually make you understand the principles, and experiences with people that will help you. Or, I'm not sure what the example could be for this type, but it ends up creating a prison where you're almost like chewing on the same things over and over again. So it's not really adding a complexity of truth, but it's just kind of this entrenchment of this cycle of one truth. So this function is extraverted feeling. So to extrovert means to turn outward. And instead of turning outward to the senses, like the second function, this one's turning outward to the feeling environment. And the number one word used about this function is harmony. So the number one goal for FE DOMs or FE users is the formation of harmonious relationships. Every single thing they do is seeking the formation of harmonious relationships. Are our values in check? Do we have rapport? Are we all vibing well as a group? Does this person need anything? It's kind of like, I see it as like an orchestra conductor kind of conducting the whole group. And so sometimes if you're too much in introverted thinking, introverted thinking as your number one strength is going to be the tool for most jobs. It's your number one strength. It's great that you use it a lot of the time, but it's not the tool for every job 100% of the time. And so to use TI all the time can sometimes be like fitting a square peg in a round hole. So sometimes FE is the tool for the job. The thing with TI being an overused weakness is I have some quotes about TI down here from Carl Jung or Vanderhoop. I prioritized quotes from Carl Jung. But introverted thinking can be stubborn and difficult to convince that it's mistaken. There can be a lot of hubris. Where on the contrary, extroverted feeling is very adaptable to praise and to criticism. And there's a way to, extroverted feeling knows that there's a way to communicate things to be very well received. And so that's something that's really good with extroverted feeling. There are quotes from Carl Jung about introverted thinking feeling awkward, ridiculous, gauche. And extroverted feeling always knows the right thing to say, always what's appropriate for the moment. And I think it gives kind of some charisma. I wanted pictures of charisma on here, but these pictures are so cheesy. So on the bottom you got that smiley face, the charisma, or the guy doing the finger guns. But I was trying to find something that represented charisma, but I'm not really finding it. But that's what that was supposed to represent. So I know a lot of ISTPs, 40s and up, who have a lot of charisma. And the difference between ISTPs who have crossed that threshold of working on extroverted feeling and the ones who haven't, it's so stark. And I feel some of the older ISTPs actually, they feel comfortable in their own skin. I never felt that whenever I'm around ISTPs, I don't get the vibe that they're awkward, but they consistently communicate to me that they feel awkward. And I think it's part of that inferiority complex. There are quotes about introverted thinking will talk itself out of feelings and having a vague dread of the opposite sex. Whereas extroverted feeling is very useful in social contexts, rapport, doing things that are appropriate for the moment. And extroverted feeling, it kind of brings people together and kind of manages kind of the culture of things. And, you can do it in a way that's more in your wheelhouse. I think if you got a group of people together and you played disc golf, for example, that's something that could be, a more stereotypical ISTP interest. Or, teaching your child how to bike. It's a way where you're doing the FE through the SE. Getting a group of people together to play volleyball, or gathering people around a barbecue, or, giving people a hug, or smiling. A lot of times extroverted feelers have incredibly good body language to make people feel welcome and invited. Whereas, introverted thinking can just kind of appear very taciturn, very reserved. So this gives kind of a, hey, I'm a nice person. Look, I'll show you with a smile on my face. Introverted thinking, there are quotes about being timid. It can feel very uncertain. And extroverted feeling gives a lot of charisma and warmth. And extroverted feeling creates community. So this is, friendships or family. It doesn't have to be a big group of people, but, you have your people and you bring people around. And especially do it in an extroverted sensing way. I think, you're not an extroverted feeling dom, so you don't want to become an extroverted feeling dom. You don't want to be doing extroverted feeling 100% of the time, but you don't want to be in TI 100% of the time. So instead of, 95% of the time in TI, 5% in FE, maybe you switch that up a little bit. Maybe you do 80-20 or you work up to that. So something that I notice about the fourth function is it can tend to be absent in general in most people, especially if they're younger. And then all of a sudden there's a spike of it. And then it goes back to being absent. And that's called a grip, especially if it's being done, not intentionally. It feels like it's happening to you, not that you have control over being in that fourth function. So, being maybe too charismatic or going out too much, or something that's very atypical for an ISTP, that's definitely not part of an ISTP stereotype. But all of a sudden just, really, having this spike of all of a sudden these relationships for a couple weeks and then back to just hermit or whatever. Raising that a little bit so that it's more even more of the time. One thing that I heard, it was from the, how do you pronounce her name, Marie von Fran's book, and she talked about that you don't really know someone until you know their fourth function. And so, you meet an ISTP and maybe they introduce you to their TI or their SE or their NI over time. But it takes a while before you get introduced maybe fully to their FE. They fully let you in. Maybe you see the body language, the smile or the hug or something. But, when they let you into, they feel a little awkward and they describe, how relationships are with social contacts or whatever. That's when I feel like I really know an ISTP. Or, seeing an ISTP get their spouse flowers or, to show affection. Or if an ISTP cooks you a meal, then you start to feel like, oh, wow, there's this whole other side to them that I feel like they've got this FE side within them. Or when they get dressed up for an event, gauging the appropriateness of an event. A lot of times ISTPs dress incredibly casual, but then you see this stuff sometimes for FE, you're like, oh, wow, okay, I didn't know you. So I always feel incredibly privileged when people let me into their fourth function, because that's your inferiority complex. There's a high level of vulnerability to go in and do something that you feel like you're not very good at. And everyone's fourth function kind of whispers at their life purpose. It's not their life purpose in general, but it kind of whispers in that direction. I think ISTPs want to mentor or want to be involved in people's lives. And I think that a lot of ISTPs that I've talked to, it's like they want friends, but they kind of don't know how to start it, or they feel that they're not verbal enough to, keep the conversation going. But I've been so grateful for the ISTPs who are really well-rounded in these areas. I think the default is to be in that first and third function a lot, but I respect so highly the ISTPs who are in extroverted sensing, the ones who didn't check out from their bodies in various ways, whether it be TV or checking out with, it could be alcohol, just different ways that introverted intuition checks you out from your body and checks you out from action taking in the world. The ones who have stayed present in the world, I just respect so highly. But getting into extroverted sensing, getting in your body, that can even be a solo activity. You want to go fishing or you want to play disc golf by yourself or, whatever that you want to do in your body. And then work on FE for a little bit, sprinkle that in, work on that for a couple years and, try to get, the full access to your strengths, because these are kind of all like tools. And so when you're in, one setting, this is the appropriate tool for the job, so I'll use this. And then when I'm in another setting, this other function is the appropriate tool for the job, so I'll use this function. And so it kind of makes you, then you have all the pieces for the type of person that you want to be. And so the antidote to that NI purposelessness or meaninglessness is just to switch that light switch up into SE. And for ISTPs, there's so much purpose within extroverted sensing, mentoring people in extroverted sensing, doing things in extroverted sensing. There's such a maturity and a skill within extroverted sensing. So if you would like more videos on the ISTP personality type or their cognitive functions, I will have my ISTP playlist linked in the description box below, so you can go into all the videos I've ever done about ISTPs. As well as on Friday, I'm going to do a live stream. I'm going to talk about the stereotypes versus archetypes. Like, how do you know if you're stereotyping versus archetyping? So yeah, especially you being a TI Dom, if you have any distinctions between stereotyping and archetyping, or the dangers of stereotyping versus something that's just a generalized truth, I would love to hear it in the comments before that live stream happens, or if you want to hop in on Friday. It'll probably be Friday afternoon. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.